What do you mean like thanks for coming today. We've got a special discussion that's going to occur, and a special guest, two special guests actually, up on stage currently. I want to introduce the one very special guest that we have today. Dr. Alexander Pruss is with us from Baylor University. Dr. Pruss has actually two PhDs, right? One in mathematics from University of British Columbia, and another one in philosophy from the University of Pittsburgh. He's got countless articles in top philosophical journals, and great, kind of probably the most well-known defender of the cosmological argument today. I think I'd be fine in putting him in that category. Definitely the number one defender of what's called the principle of sufficient reason. So it's with great honor that we go ahead and welcome Dr. Pruss. Just wait.
All right. So it's a pleasure to be here. I want to start by saying that what I see as the point of this discussion, the point isn't for me to defend what I think. It's more, I'm a firm believer that one of the good ways of getting at the truth of things is to try to see what are the best arguments on both sides. And so we've divided it up. I'm going to give the arguments on one side, and Professor Besong will give the arguments on the other side. I'm not saying that I'm personally convinced by the things that I'm arguing for. I'm actually kind of accept half of what I'm saying. You'll see a little bit later. but I think the arguments are powerful and interesting, and so I'll try to defend them. Let me start with this. So our question is, are there animals in heaven? And the answer is, of course there are. Why? Well, look, every human being is a mammal. Every mammal is an animal. There are human beings in heaven, so there are animals in heaven. This is indisputable logic, right? Are we done? No. Okay, right, seriously, the question is not about us, right, but about other animals, the ones that we say, you know, philosophers like to say are non-rational or something like that. So they don't have the kind of reason and intelligence, at least not right now, that we do, but have some other kind of reason and intelligence than ours. So the question is about those animals. And I'm going to be, in this part, my side of the debate, defending two different theses. The first is what I call animals in heaven, that there are some non-rational animals in heaven. The second is what I'll call the from earth to heaven thesis, that some of these animals in heaven used to live on earth. That's a separate thing, right? You could think there are animals in heaven, but they're new animals that God has created specially for that purpose, for being in heaven. So that this particular dog, if that's all there was, would never be in heaven. The second thesis, that some from earth to heaven, says that at least some of the animals that lived on earth, probably, perhaps not every one, maybe not, say, the mosquitoes, but quite likely this dog, do go to heaven. Okay, now I said, I kind of half agree. I'm actually pretty strongly inclined to believe that there are animals in heaven, but the animal resurrection, or the from earth to heaven thesis for animals, I'm much less sure of. So let me start with the animals in heaven, and not just humans. And let me say what led me to this. I was in England. It was a lovely, cool, pleasant summer day. I was sitting in a sort of garden-like lawn and atmosphere at an Oxford college. It was really beautiful, and there were birds chirping and insects buzzing, and it was lovely. And I thought to myself, you know, what's a garden without animals? What's a garden without birds and insects? It would be too quiet, just wouldn't have the sounds proper to a garden. And what's the biblical image of heaven? Well, one of them, there are many, and some of them are warn us against images, like that it's what eye has not seen nor ear heard, but one of the images is paradise. And the Greek word paradisos means a garden or a park. So I think the biblical image suggests a garden or a park, something like that, something where we live in a harmony with nature. And that, I think, very naturally includes animals. I mean, just even leaving aside the purely biological point that the kinds of plants we know of, many of them are just dependent on animals for pollination. I mean, God could no doubt have them be pollinated in other ways. I think one of my kids was joking, maybe angels going around with paintbrushes and pollinating the plants. But it seems like it's much more natural that they be pollinated by the kinds of things they're made for. If at least they're plants like we know. Okay, so that's the first thought. The second thought, we are, and that's not unrelated, we are ourselves, as I said at the beginning, animals. We're living organisms. And I think the flourishing of an animal, or generally of an organism, means that to be like, live your life fully as an organism, you need to be in harmony with your ecosystem, the right kind of ecosystem for us. And the ecosystem for us, humans, consists of plants and animals and fungi and other things like that. We're created to eat at least plants, and we're created to interact with animals. That's just part of our nature, I think, as human beings, and our flourishing includes that. The biblical image is humans are made to be stewards over plants and animals. but I think this just kind of fits with our picture that being away from nature is not forever, is not what we're meant for. God creates a diverse world. And I think it's very fitting that this diverse world has a rich hierarchy of beings. We've got purely spiritual beings, like angels. We've got beings that combine the spiritual and the physical, us, and maybe aliens, if there are any. We've got beings that have the physical aspect and have consciousness, but don't have the kind of intelligence that we do, and the kind of will that we do, and those are the higher non-rational animals. We have beings that are physical, alive, but not conscious, like the lower animals, plants, fungi, bacteria, and so on. And finally, at the bottom of the hierarchy, we've got physical things that aren't alive at all, like the stuff that rocks are made of. And it would seem unfitting if parts of this hierarchy just died out at the end, at the last judgment. Whole segments of that hierarchy just disappeared. It seems like there's something very fitting about having this hierarchy as part of God's ultimate plan. The church fathers in the New Testament both talk of Christ's redemption as something that has a cosmic significance. Paul says that all of creation has been groaning in labor pains until now. Well, labor pains is where things are born, not when things die. So it doesn't seem to me to be an image of mass extinction of animals. Now, this doesn't, I guess, prove that the animals are in heaven. Maybe you could say the universe will contain things other than heaven and some animals outside there. But why? I mean, if there are going to be animals somewhere else in the universe, why not with us, given that we seem to be made for harmony with the animals? It's at least suggested. Okay, so that's my little case for there being animals in heaven. Now what about, are there some animals like this one that have first lived on earth and then went to heaven later? Before arguing for that, I think I want to note that animals have souls. If you don't have a soul, you're basically just like a rock. You may be more sophisticated at rock, like this phone here, but you're basically just made of rocks and rocky. And you can maybe do sort of things like show time, or have games played on you, and maybe even like help people cheat on term papers. But it's really, you're basically just a rock. Animals are alive. Dogs can feel pain. Cats can feel pain. We don't know exactly how far down in the hierarchy of things you can have some kind of conscious feelings of pain and pleasure and things like that. I don't know if earthworms do it or shrimp, but dogs surely do. And a mere machine would not feel anything. So I think, so that they're not just machines, they have to have something that goes beyond just matter arranged a certain way. They have to have a soul to make them be alive. It's not a different kind of soul from the one we have. It's not a rational soul, but it's still a soul. And as long as it's a soul, as long as there's something in them that's not material, that means there's something that could survive, that God could keep in existence if he wanted to, after the body is destroyed, and then that he could build around to rebuild the animal later on if he so chose. This is not it may sound a little strange to say animals have soul. This is not an unusual thing in the Catholic tradition. Most of the great thinkers of the Catholic tradition, like Duns Scotus or Thomas Aquinas, would fully agree that animals have souls, though not the kind of souls that we do, because their souls make them be alive. The book of Genesis says that animals have the breath of life. And breath of life is exactly what God gives to us to make us be alive. And what does he give us? He gives us soul. So breath of life is soul. So we have, they're creatures of body and soul. So Catholics believe that the physical properties of bread and wine continue existing in the Eucharist even after the bread and wine is gone. It would be even easier than that for God to make the soul of an animal continue to exist after the animal's gone, if he so chose. But did he so choose? Well, I want to think about two sets of arguments quickly. One focuses on us, the other on animals. The human-centered argument is pretty easy, right? There's a companionship, a love. Look at them. Look how between humans and this kind of relationship. It's a kind of love that should not destroy love. The resurrection should not destroy love. So humans, for the sake of humans, it makes sense for the animals to continue existing and be taken. An argument based on animals. Over hundreds of millions of years, animals have suffered horrendously. I mean, it's been an dog-eat-dog world out there, right? Dinosaurs eating other dinosaurs. It's been nasty. Now, in the case of human suffering, the best answer to the problem of evil is to focus on the way that our suffering is connected to our growth in virtues like perseverance, sacrificial love, forgiveness. Because of this, but we can't, it seems hard to say that for animals. Animals don't grow in virtues like that through suffering. So because of this, a number of philosophers have argued that the problem of animal suffering is much worse than the problem of human suffering as an argument against the existence of God. Because of this, I think it is very fitting that God compensate animals after death for the suffering that they have undergone as part of God's plan of creation and evolution. And he could compensate them even by building up their souls so that they become more sophisticated. This argument is due to Trent Doherty in his book on animal suffering. It's also, I think, very fitting that animals go from earth to heaven. Let me try two little arguments. Suppose we accept that there are animals in heaven. It would be fitting that we be with the descendants of earth animals rather than with just some random other animals. It seems more natural, and God's grace builds on nature. But how could this work? If we're going to be with the kinds of animals that we know, then it seems like at some point a descendant of an earth animal would need to be transported to heaven. And there we have the from earth to heaven thesis. Unless you have some extra weird miracle like where the animal reproduces on earth and the offspring comes into existence in heaven, sort of at a distance, not in the way reproduction normally happens. God could do that by miracle, but it seems a needless miracle. It seems much simpler for God to transport animals from earth to heaven. Or consider the animals that are alive during Christ's second coming. And this is think about this, it's a time of life, a new life. The graves are opening. Why would the animals be then dying out at that moment? It just does not seem fitting that the animals, at the moment of the resurrection of the human dead, would suddenly all fall down dead. Like, it's a very different image, I think, than the one I think we have. And it doesn't seem like the biblical image. I mean, Isaiah says the cow and the bear shall graze, and their young shall lay down together, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox. I mean, it seems fitting that the animals continue to exist past this. Now, there's lots and lots of questions you can ask. You could ask, will animals, including us, eat other animals? Maybe not. I just quoted the passage from Isaiah that suggests not. Maybe God has some other way of meeting their nutritional needs, and the delights of the hunt can be met with really good cat toys for the cats and the lions. On the other hand, there's some suggestion that maybe they're still eating meat. Jesus ate a piece of fish after his resurrection. So that's a possibility. There's a question about reproduction and death. I'm inclined to say that the two go together. There will either be both reproduction and death for animals in heaven, or neither. Thank you.
Thank you very much for all that truth that you were articulating there. Next, we have Dr. Brian Besong, who's also known as, hater of puppies and rainbows and animal knowledge and of all things good. No, Dr. Besong is a professor here, really great human being, just personal friend, and His work on natural law is actually something that I used outside of this university before I even came here, before I even realized I was going to be colleagues with Dr. Besong. And his work primarily, at least when it comes to publishing in journals, has related to moral knowledge, moral epistemology. Anyway, Dr. Besong, it's your turn. This is St. Clair, by the way. But hey, by the way, shouldn't Dr. Besong pet St. Clair?
I don't have a sink. I have to wash my hands afterwards. All right, well, in the history of Christian theology, there are a few debates that have generated such passion. Debates that seem to rise above the level of just mere academics, right? In the 3rd and 4th century, people debated whether Christ was fully human and fully divine. In the 16th century, Protestants debated with Catholics about the nature of salvation. And today we've got a perennial question: do dogs go to heaven? All right, now I realize I am Dr. Wet Blanket, right? And that I am taking the contrarian position. So by way of apology, I'll begin with a joke. All right, one day, God is looking out of the pearly gates, and he sees 2 dogs, a golden retriever and a boxer, and a Siamese cat. Now, you don't get many animals outside the heavenly gates, so God comes over and asks, "What are you doing here?" And the golden retriever says, "We believe that we have merited heaven, that we deserve a place here." God, being the just judge, says, "Okay, well, I'll hear you out." The boxer starts and says, "I always lived a valiant life, loyal to my master. In fact, I died defending his life against a violent intruder." After consideration, God said, "Okay, come in. There's a seat for you there among the saints." The golden retriever was next and said, "Although I never performed works of great valiancy or heroism, I was purchased by parents in a very difficult time for some children, and I was a companion to them through thick and thin. I got them through the hardest times of their life." After consideration, God says, "Yes, you deserve a place here. There's a seat for you there among the saints." Finally, the cat turns to the cat and he says, "And what about you? Is there a place for you here?" And the cat timidly clears her throat. "I believe you're in my seat." All right, so let's start with a question. What do we know about heaven? Now, of course, everyone has these intuitions about what heaven will be like, but it's not our kingdom, right? So we have to rely upon what Christ has told us about his kingdom. Now, there's a very interesting passage that comes up. The Sadducees, who denied the resurrection, tried to deny the resurrection, tried to prove that the resurrection was implausible or absurd by posing to Christ a question. They asked, there was a woman who was married to a man he died childless, and so she was married to a second man, and so on and so forth after 7 husbands. Finally, she died childless. At the resurrection, they asked, whose husband or whose wife will she be? Jesus' answer, for those of you who know the Gospels, is that they are deeply mistaken about the nature of the afterlife. He says, in the resurrection, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. Christ's response, in my view, is suggestive. In more ways than one, I think that naive view of what heaven is like could very well be mistaken. Living a life like the angels is a life that's substantially different from the life that we live now. Just to give you a couple examples, angels don't have sex, to put it bluntly, so not having sex, there's no use for marriage. Nor do the angels eat. They're bodiless spirits. In fact, in Revelations, Christ indicates that, quote, they will hunger no more and thirst no more. The sun will not strike them, nor any scorching heat. These are images of heaven, and you could say that they blend with the view of a garden, but maybe it's a garden of a very different sort. After all, there's no sun. Now, for many people, a life without food, drink, or sex sounds like a hellscape. Don't fret. As the polka song puts it, in heaven there is no beer, that's why we drink it here. Now, St. Paul describes the nature of heaven in this way. He says, "For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then we will see face to face. Now I know only in part, then I will know fully, even as I have been fully known." The Catholic Church and many Christian theologians outside of Catholicism have understood heaven to involve centrally something known as the beatific vision, seeing God as he is, seeing that face to face. Our nature, Christ seems to suggest, will be elevated through the beatific vision so that our future blessedness will involve surpassing the animal appetites that we have presently. After all, we will be like the angels. Our nature is capable of this because we are made in God's image. We, uniquely among the animals, have reason. And having reason, we can choose God, and we can also choose to go away from God. That's a very important part of us. We can also grasp the infinite. Through reason, God can reveal himself to us, and we can see it. We are capable of that. We've been created capable of that. So the common view among theologians, including Thomas Aquinas, is that the beatific vision will so surpassingly complete our joy in the highest part of our nature, namely reason, that the rest of our nature will be ultimately satisfied and at rest. So what does this mean for animals? Well, lacking reason, they cannot choose God nor oppose him. They're not moral agents and likewise have no guilt. Being merely innocent, however, does not mean heaven. Those of you who have heard the parable of the workers in the vineyard in Matthew 20 know that heaven is gestured at as a merited reward. It's not just an after party that everyone gets to go to unless they're Hitler. So how do we merit heaven? Well, simply, we cooperate with Christ. Again, relying on the Gospels, John 15 indicates this participation as essential to our heavenly reward. So Christ says, "I am the vine, you are the branches. Those who abide in me and I in them bear much fruit, because apart from me you can do nothing. Whoever does not abide in me is thrown away like a branch and withers. Such branches are gathered, thrown into the fire, and burned." Because animals lack moral agency, they cannot abide in Christ. They cannot be the branches with the vine of Christ. We're even told how abiding works a little bit later in the same passage. Jesus says, "As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love." In other words, the animal kingdom could only merit heaven if it could participate in a sort of moral agency with Christ, abiding in his love through living out charity. As the book of James puts it, a person is justified by works and not by faith alone, and it's that justification that opens the door to heaven. It's that friendship that Christ has offered to us, and that's how we get there. So given that animals can't do what's required, it seems like they wouldn't be in. Now I know what you're thinking. Well, that's just for us, right? Certainly God made a doggy door too. Against this, I have 3 arguments. Argument number 1 is an argument from authority. Although Christian and Catholic tradition has been a little silent, if you look up heaven, you'll often just get descriptions of the beatific vision. But the contemporary catechism does have several lines about what heaven is. So in section 1024, we're told, "This perfect life with the most holy Trinity, this communion of life and love with the Trinity, with the Virgin Mary, the angels, and all the blessed, is called heaven. Heaven is the ultimate end and fulfillment of the deepest human longings, the state of supreme, definitive happiness." 2 lines down at 1026, it says, "He makes partners in his heavenly glorification those who have believed in him and remained faithful to his will." And here's a very interesting line. It says this, "Heaven is the blessed community of all who are perfectly incorporated into Christ." Heaven is the blessed community of all who are perfectly incorporated into Christ. Well, it doesn't seem like animals could do that. So, quite simply, they wouldn't be in heaven, even if they had a blessed state. If they had a blessed state, an afterlife which is blessed in some special way, it wouldn't be heaven. It would be nice, but it's not heaven. But I don't even think that they could have a blessed state that has a heavenly parallel. So this is my argument number 2. I think that the blessedness of an animal is entirely this worldly. So think about, if you don't have the beatific vision, if you don't have the supreme delight in God, what is there left? Okay, so you're thinking about an animal life and you think, okay, well, what's it going to do? After all, if you think about what a happy animal is like, it's not just the destination, it's also the journey. It's not just the end result, it's also the activities that get it there. So think about the activities that make animals happy. For instance, they eat, right? Okay, so if they are eating, they would presumably get hungry. If they get hungry, it seems like they've got some variation in their blessedness, right? After all, they get hungry and then they're satisfied. One could also ask, if they're eating, are they defecating? Right? It seems strange to think that heaven involves certain messes that people might have to clean up. Similarly, you think about the other things that animals typically do. They reproduce. It would be strange to think that in the heavenly landscape, you've got dogs copulating off behind a tree. And yet, this is one of the central activities of the animal life. In fact, if you think about it, I would say it's the highest of the animal activities, is to reproduce for themselves. They sacrifice much, their well-being, they'll defend themselves against predators much larger than them, for the sake of what? Reproduction, to defend their young. So the fact that animal lives are so driven to reproduction, when reproduction doesn't seem to fit the heavenly landscape. I mean, think about it. If dogs were in heaven for eternity, and they were constantly making more dogs, there'd be like exponentially large numbers of animals. You could also ask, so, I mean, hunger and eating seemed a little weird. Reproduction seems strange. What about challenges? Because animals like to be challenged. It's not just catching a frisbee, it's also chasing the frisbee. So what are they going to be challenged by? I saw a meme recently that said that God will pair up squirrel hell with dog heaven, so that dogs can constantly chase and eat squirrels that have, damaged things as a fitting reward for both. But that seems pretty strange, right? That squirrels are going to be attacked. At the same time, you know, right, if you've ever had an animal, that cat toys just don't do it, right? Frisbees are not as enjoyable as chasing animals. After all, these are their evolutionarily driven drives. That's what it means to be an animal. So their drives seem to be better satisfied in this world than in the next. Like what heaven looks like for us doesn't have a great parallel for a dog. Now you could just like punt and say, okay, God's just gonna like fill them up with pleasure, right? Like some big heroin overdose that doesn't actually kill them. All right, so just, constantly rolling around in pleasure. But that doesn't seem to be a fulfillment of animal nature. That just seems to be a placation of it, right? And it's just an opiate. Okay, so this leads me to my third argument. After all, you might think, well, the activity, maybe it's not eating or reproducing or sleeping or being challenged, that its blessedness would consist in. Rather, it's spending time with me, right? My dog, my cat, spending time with me after my death. So this is an argument that I call the argument from "can't you leave me alone for half a second?" Pets have been bred to be attached. In fact, just sitting near Dr. McNabb's dog, it just keeps whining for me to touch it. So some dogs are more attached than others. So it seems like one activity that they could have in heaven is spending time with their master. However, there's some issues here. So to steal a line from the Sadducees, there was once a little boy named Timmy, and Timmy had a dog named Lassie. Lassie died. Lassie was replaced by another Lassie. Those of you who know the show may know that there were 9 Lassies in total, with one little boy, Timmy. So after 9 Lassies, Timmy dies. Which of those 9 Lassies does Timmy need to spend all his waking moments with? Now, if you think managing the needs and desire for affection of 9 dogs is okay, maybe you actually think that sounds delightful, just imagine someone who's had many more dogs, right? Perhaps 40 or 50 or 500. Does their heaven really consist centrally in entertaining and being involved in the life of this animal? Never mind the fact that this only allows pets in heaven and not, say, gazelles or giraffes or primates. One can also ask the question, what is the animals there for? Is it to perfect the animal or to perfect the person? To satisfy the person, the master, or the animal? It seems like if you say it's for the animal, then if Timmy, say, commits a mortal sin right before he dies and doesn't make it up, those lassies are kind of, well, in a world of hurt, or just non-existent. Similarly, it doesn't seem like Timmy would need to be perfected by animals, since after all now he has the beatific vision. At any rate, I see the blessedness of animals in this life primarily, and not in heaven. Thank you.
All right. We will now proceed. We're going to give each speaker 10 minutes to respond to each other, and then we'll have some cross-examination. So 10 minutes first for Dr. Pruss.
Okay. So, I agree, of course, that the central aspect of our happiness is not, in heaven, is not enjoying time playing frisbee with one's dog and so on. That's delightful, but of course, it all pales before the vision of God face to face, which is the central aspect of our happiness. However, and there is a however, the New Testament also emphasizes our bodily resurrection. There are 2 stages for most of us. First, we die, and our body rots, during which time the soul enjoys, hopefully, the vision of God, perhaps after some time in purgatory. But that's without a body. But then comes the resurrection of the body, and the soul is reunited with the body and becomes a fully integral human being. This is a less important part than our union with God in love and knowledge of God, but it is still an important part. Why is it important? It's important because we're beings of soul and body. And so it's important that our fulfillment fit that it be both spiritual and physical, that we not just be half beings. And yes, I think that makes a lot of sense to think that there will be eating in heaven. Jesus ate a piece of fish after the resurrection. He talked of drinking the new wine. That one might be metaphorical, but the fish is definitely sounds literal. It is true that we are told in Revelation they will hunger no more and thirst no more, and the sun will not strike them nor any scorching heat. I think you could, on the hunger and thirst, you could say, well, here's one possibility. Maybe you just are well enough supplied with food and drink that you don't get to the point of hunger and thirst. Another possibility is that, there's like a difference between hunger and thirst as a problem, the kind of thing that all too many human beings suffer from, who are insecure in their food supply. There's that horrible feeling of an empty stomach, a fear of where you will find your next meal, that feeling of drying up from thirst. There's that will not be there in heaven. But there's a mild version, right? When it's getting to be dinner time and you are one of the more fortunate people who has a good dinner coming up ahead of you, but nonetheless you feel a little peckish. That is not a suffering at all. That is only makes the dinner more pleasant when it comes. And that kind of thing is not a bad thing, and so I think it could be in heaven. And I think, though, Professor Besong made a very important point, though, that I think there is a sense in which we might want to say animals are not in heaven. I think there are 2 senses of what it is to be in heaven. There's the more important sense of being in heaven, which is the state of union of love and mind with God. That is the most important. But there's something more. The book of Revelation talks of the new earth. This is a place. Why is it a place? Because we get back our bodies at the resurrection, and bodies have to be in a place. Bodies are physical things that occupy place. So there's a place. Being in that place we can call being in heaven, in a second sense. After the resurrection, we human beings will be in heaven in both senses. We will be united with God, and there will be a delightful place we will be in. Now, non-rational animals, as long as they stay non-rational, cannot have the union of love and mind with God, but they can still be in that place. And probably, right? I mean, there are buildings there. Rocks. So there are things other than rational beings there, if only rocks. So I'm willing to concede an important point, that maybe in the fullest sense of in heaven, there are no animals in heaven, maybe. So I'll say a little more about this. But in another sense, and that other sense is still literally true, they could be. Because we could say the animals are on the new earth, and the new earth is in a sense heaven. But there is another possibility. The philosopher Trent Doherty, in his book on animal pain, reminds us that C.S. Lewis, in The Magician's Nephew, describes animals being raised to a new level, made rational like us, while still remaining the same individuals. Think about it this way. This beatific vision of God, this union with God, infinitely exceeds our powers. It requires God's infinite grace to bring about for us. It infinitely exceeds us because we are not capable of union of the infinite being. But God's grace can bridge that. But now our rationality exceeds the powers of a dolphin or a dog only to a finite degree. There's less of a gap between the dog and me than there is between me and someone who enjoys the beatific vision. It would be easier even easier for God to bridge the gap from animals to humans than to take me and make me capable of the beatific vision. So it seems God could miraculously do it. Maybe he even does. In the Old Testament, he makes Balaam's donkey speak. And speaking seems like a mark of rationality. Now, maybe it's only temporary. Maybe it's not really literally speaking. Maybe it's God making sounds through its vocal apparatus. I don't know. But it's at least suggestive. Doherty thinks that a perfectly loving God wouldn't just compensate animals for their suffering in this life, but would enfold their suffering by uniting them to him in something like the way he desires to unite humans to him. But suppose we go for the more modest versions, where the animals stay non-rational, they stay the kinds of things they are, more or less. What would they enjoy? I take it we will have most of the animal life still, not counting reproduction. Why not reproduction? Because reproduction I don't know, maybe it's because reproduction is just a temporary phase of human life. I mean, this is biologically clear in the case of women, but also true in the case of men, probably. Right? It's a temporary phase of human life to reproduce. There's a reproductive age, it comes at a certain age, and then it goes away at a certain other age. It's a stage of life. It's not required for full human functioning that it continue. Maybe animals could have. So we have pretty much a full animal life in heaven, I think. And so why can't the animals have their animal life? The compensation argument, I think, doesn't actually need animals to have the kind of blessedness we do. I think it just needs them to have enough blessedness to compensate for the sufferings they've had. I think the most difficult question about interaction between animals is what happens in the case of animals that prey on each other, the dogs and squirrels case. There are indications in Scripture that in the Garden of Eden, all the animals were vegetarians. Because God says to every beast of the earth and every bird of the air and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food. If God solved the problem before, he can solve it again. Now, perhaps there's just playful chasing, akin to tag, enjoyed by the squirrel and dog alike. Sometimes the squirrel wins, sometimes the dog wins, but in good sportsmanship, each enjoys the other's victory. There may be, or maybe this is sort of darker, but maybe, there's like a hierarchy, and the squirrel gives its life for the dog sometimes, and that's just part of the hierarchy of life, the circle of life. I think it's good. I like Dr. Besong's Sadducee-like argument about the pet case, but it seems to me that God can reattach animals to new people. We might think that we don't want God making massive changes to the psychology of humans in heaven because that would override our free will, but animals don't have free will. I think God could reattach animals to other humans if necessary and repair them in all sorts of ways, and God doesn't have to consult the animals for that. All that said, I should end by saying, I'm not 100% sure of this. I'm not even like 80% sure of this. This part about there being earth animals taken to heaven. God could have some other way of compensating animals. There might be some other answer to the problem of animal pain. The argument for the thesis that earth animals go to heaven is not conclusive, but it is suggestive. I think it's a decent kind of argument. Thank you.
So Dr. Pruss has raised several, I think, very important arguments. I want to address three things just for the sake of time. The first thing that I want to talk about is the diversity of being. It seems like it would be unfitting for God to have created this manifold world, right, with all sorts of levels and gradations of goodness, and then one might think just cast it aside, right? Would God act in vain in this way, given all his creation? In order to respond to that adequately, we have to ask the question, why did God create the world? Like, what was the good in the creation of the world? Well, presumably, the good was created to reflect his grandeur. But why is a reflection of his grandeur a good? I mean, think about it. Why create a photograph when the reality is right there? I mean, God's literally everywhere. Why does he need to create, to use a phrase from St. Paul, a dim or dark mirror of himself? It seems like the reality is much better. So why would God create a world reflecting his grandeur? What's the good of it? It seems like if there were not rational beings to appreciate that grandeur, something would be missing. It would be underappreciated, undervalued. So here's a possibility that conjoins with this view of creation, this grandeur of goodness, that this world is a place of trial and merit, a place where we're given a taste and an opportunity. In my own view, it's important for God to reveal his glory to creation who have not yet merited the reality to which this creation is but a pale shadow. So we as creatures learn of God through creation, but every aspect of creation is not eternally important. Some of it can be cast away. Only those beings with a natural subsistence, beings who are rational, angels, humans, and who can thus grasp the even concept of an eternal life, have some eternal significance. It seems to go together, right? An ability to grasp the eternal and the possibility of an eternity. That is, the world as we know it, in my view, with its hierarchy of being, has only transitional value. Value to provide us that taste of what heaven can be like and why it's worth striving for. Put differently, it is that dark mirror mentioned by St. Paul. Once we can see face to face, we're not going to want the dark mirror. It no longer has the value it once did. Now there's another part of this, a second argument that I think is, Dr. Pruss brings it up, but it's also the most common argument I hear that your pets go to heaven. So something like this is very, very simple. Heaven is perfect happiness. My dog is essential for perfect happiness. QED. I even heard one student today tell me she doesn't want to go to heaven if her dog is not going to be there with her. Now, of course, intuition drives us, right? It's essentially an intuitive argument. But there's something important about that intuition. It's not like it's all wrong, right? There is a powerful, important, and respectable intuition, namely that God does not destroy true goodness. Whatever is truly and importantly good, eternally good, can't be destroyed. Now, being eternal creatures aimed at the good, every good thing in this life seems to need a heavenly correlate. And as relationships with animals are purportedly good, they too must have a continuation in heaven. So if the relationships with animals are in fact for our good, right, it doesn't seem like God would destroy that. That would seem to destroy some of the goodness that he's created. So here's my view. All true goods will be in heaven, but they may not be in the form that we assume they will be in. After all, perhaps not just as often, but you'll also hear people say, I don't want to be in heaven if there's no whiskey, right? Or poker, or dancing, or fill in the blank. Now, it is different, the relationship that you have with a pet, but we can't just assume that because a person so deeply values it, it therefore must be in heaven with them. It's only if that thing is truly good for the person. Now, community is good. Relationships are good. But I would say that the relationships that we have with animals are imitations of proper relationships with people. Now, there's one thing that I think many of you know from experience, and that is the relationship that you have with an animal is a little bit different than the relationship you have with people. Namely, the animal loves you with this unconditional, never-varying love. In fact, I think that dog was licking his face during the debate. So, there it is. Something good, I guess. But there is this innocence, right? This love and affection that's there, and that seems to be good. But at the same time, we have to wonder, is that the real good? Or is it something that is, again, a transitional good? A mirror darkly that reflects a love that we actually want much more deeply. Namely, the love of God, right? And so it seems like, yes, every good thing in this life will be in heaven, but maybe the good that people strive after with their pets is not the pet. It's the love, it's the affection, it's the unconditional valuing, which we can only get from God. So the fact that we value these relationships so deeply doesn't by itself indicate to me that therefore God would not end them. All right, the third argument that I want to address, and then I'll be finished, is this problem of animal suffering. So Dr. Pruss raises the possibility that animals will be raised to rationality, and once they are raised to rationality, then they can have the beatific vision like us. That would solve, it seems like, the problem of animal suffering. It would also solve the problem of pets in heaven. There's a few things to say here. First of all, I think when we reflect back on what I just said about the good of the relationship that you have with your pet, it's not, I don't think most of us want Fido to start reasoning with us, trying to persuade us to play Frisbee, right? That would be a very different relationship if the animal suddenly becomes a sort of hybrid. It also seems like it breaks down the centrality of humanity in the creation story. It seems significant in Genesis that we are alone created in the image and likeness of God, right? That seems to be broken down because it turns out that we're just the people created initially in the image and likeness of God, but it turns out everything else that suffers will also eventually be given the image and likeness of God. So what's our special value? That we got to merit? Well, here's an argument that an animal might have. I was deprived of a central opportunity. If you were going to give me reason after all, God, then why didn't you give it to me in life so that I could get a better seat, so that I could merit, so that I could cooperate and participate, because that would be a greater good than merely getting reason upon my death and likewise given this sort of like shallow beatific vision. So it seems like the animal would then have a complaint. If you were going to do this, shouldn't you have done it much earlier? I think personally that if you raised an animal to rationality, you've changed it. It's no longer that animal, and it's no longer the relationship that we value. Given it a rational soul is just to create a new being with a psychological continuity with an old old animal. So I think Giving it reason just passes the buck, right? Now you're rewarding a new animal, a new creature. So to resume a point that I raised earlier, if it's not the beatific vision, in what would their blessedness consist? The picture that Dr. Pruss paints, I argue, is an attenuated, it's a thin form of the blessedness that animals can have in this life. If an animal had to choose a blessed life in this world, where they actually got to catch the squirrel, eat the mouse, right, etc., spend every waking moment with their master, I think that's what they'd choose. Why? Well, because think about all the activities that are suddenly ceasing for the animal in this blessed state. As I mentioned before, it seems to me that reproduction is the aim, the ultimate end that the animal is striving for. We are creatures, every part of us, our heart beats to pump blood. Our eardrums work to hear sound, and we as creatures are teleologically, we are goal-oriented beings. As humans, we're aimed at happiness. But there is no similar parallel in the animal world, and so I argue that it is procreation. So once that's done, the animals live, but their life is sort of pointless. 1 minute? 30 seconds, okay. Now Dr. Pruss admits that perhaps they reproduce, but if they reproduce, they've got to die. And so what I would argue is, at this point, what has heaven added? If they're going to die, couldn't they just have a blessedness in this life? And now here we can simplify. Perhaps what God does is unknown to us, but creates a blessedness among the animal world in a way that actually does satisfy their deepest needs, which are this worldly. And we may be blind to it, all the same. It seems like they are created for this world, and if they are to have a blessed existence, it would be in this world too. Thank you.
All right, so we're gonna transition now to having a discussion just kind of between the two of them where they can kind of cross-examine each other in an informal way. And we'll start with Dr. Pruss, but I do have a question for everyone here. I know this might be, after a long academic day, your brains might be tired. So I have a question for you. Who wants Dr. Besong to pet the puppy, to pet Claire?
Will I gain if I pet the dog?
All right, well now if we can go ahead, we'll have this exchange between Dr. Pruss and Dr. Besong.
So, I'm curious on this picture on which so much is just transitory and has only temporary value, what there is on this view in heaven besides us.
That's a great question. So the landscape
Us
of heaven.
and angels and God.
Yeah, I mean,
Or is there an earth on the new earth?
I don't know what is meant by a new earth. So it does seem like God would recreate. But it seems like the question would be, what role does it play? It wouldn't be created in vain, right? So here it does play a role for us, right? And it does seem like creation is constantly sort of subservient to the human good. It seems in this way, for this reason, we are stewards. So I guess the question would be, if there's a heavenly landscape, it's not just us sort of floating around with God there and the angels, what value, like to what end would, say, the floor be created, or a building, or the New Jerusalem? It seems like it would serve some value, but we've already got the value perfectly fulfilled in God. So I guess I'm punting. I don't know the answer to it, but it does seem like one could take as the default position, well, we know there's humans, we know there's angels, we know there's God, and we've got this imagery, but we don't know whether it's metaphorical or literal, and so it's simpler just to take it as metaphorical.
You know, it seems a very strange picture to have these bodies just floating there.
With hearts, of course.
Yeah, with hearts. I mean, doesn't seem like what bodies are for. I mean, they're legs, you know, they're for walking on rocks, you know. They push against things, and it makes the resurrection, you know, of the body seem pointless.
Yeah, so it does seem like, and the church's tradition has been that we are given additional sort of, like our resurrection bodies are glorified in these certain ways that have properties that seem spatiotemporal, right? So, like Christ was able to walk through the wall. What's the point of a property if there's no walls? If we've got this sort of sublimity of the human body, it seems like there would be a purpose there. All the same, you know, when I think about many of the tasks that we do perform, they don't seem plausible to me to have a heavenly correlate. So I guess I'm left with some of that shrouded in mystery. But to give a simple argument about eating is more pleasurable when we're more hungry. You know, sometimes late at night I'll prepare a dinner, and my kids, I tell them that hunger is the secret sauce, because every time it's a 9 p.m. dinner, they just love it. And so the hungrier we are, the better the meal really is. And so this idea of eating when we just get peckish seems to be not that great. Like, it seems like if you're going to add something, it's not adding much value. Although it is true that we have, you know, a mouth and teeth and all that in the resurrection. So I don't find that imagery to fit perfectly. And for that reason, some of this is shrouded in mystery for me. So I guess I'll ask the next question. So it seems like to continue that line, if we are to eat, or if animals are to eat, it seems like the only reason to do that would be that it would increase the blessedness of us or the animals. How would it increase our blessedness? Well, at least two ways. First, it would increase our pleasure, or second, it would fulfill our nature, our animalistic needs. Well, if it's to increase our pleasure, then it seems like our pleasure increases in proportion to the hunger that we experience. But then we'd have to be waxing and waning in hunger. Additionally, if it seems like it fulfills our animal instincts, then why are many of our other animal instincts sort of left to be thrown away, such as that of procreation?
Yeah, well, procreation, I think, may just be a temporary thing for at least for human animals. It doesn't seem like it's not a disability if a woman of 60 is unable to reproduce. There's nothing wrong with her, right? You can't go, well, you're 60 to the doctor and say, yes, sorry, doctor, I can't have a baby, there's something wrong with me. I assume that the doctor says, let me tell you something about human biology. It's not good news, there's nothing wrong with you, right? So there's nothing wrong with, I think, eventually lacking the capacity for reproduction. But the other things, yeah, food, why not? I think, so C.S. Lewis talks about these sort of pleasures that are satisfactions of need and pleasures that are not. And I think food can be both. So he says, you know, there's like, you walk along somewhere and you smell something that's a really lovely smell, maybe flowers or something. It doesn't satisfy any previous need. You weren't like really hungry for that smell ahead of time, but you can still really appreciate it. It seems like you could, to some degree, food is like that too, and we can have that. But I don't know that it's actually just about the pleasure. I think it just fulfills our nature. Our nature is to eat. It's part of our nature. To eat, to circulate the blood, to breathe, all these things seem to be part of our nature. And not to have that is to be lacking fulfillment of some part of our nature. Even if the most important part is fulfilled, there's still something unfulfilled. Think of, you go for a date with somebody you love, the companionship is by far the most important thing. But wouldn't you rather the food was decent?
Can I have one brief follow-up?
Yeah.
I guess I should ask Tyler. Okay, so when you hear the verse that we shall be like the angels in heaven, to you that centrally applies just to the cessation of procreation, which actually already occurred in this life, which would make us like the angels in heaven.
That's interesting. Oh. Well, I think it's not just that. It's also there because after that transformation, there will be no marriage anymore.
It seems like women in menopause don't think that this is the angelic life.
Right. No, I think that there is something there. Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's right. I mean, there is a transformation. There is a change of some kind. I just don't think it would make sense to have, it seems kind of pointless to have a resurrection of the body if most of the functions cease. If we don't, say, talk anymore, because we're just floating in space with no air, but just communicate by telepathy or seeing each other's thoughts in our vision of God. Yeah, that doesn't seem like it fulfills the full human being, even though it would make us happy. I mean, I kind of can sense how some of you might say some of this, but you talked a fair amount about meriting. How does this fit with grace and with the fact that there are some, at least some, perhaps many in heaven who have done nothing of their free will? Say, those who died as baptized infants.
Right. So it seems like the church's teaching about merit, which is very straightforward, that heaven is a merited reward. Again, following from the parable of the workers in the vineyard, the church's teaching will always apply to sort of like questionable marginal cases. But the idea is that when grace is infused into us, that we now have an acquired capacity to merit a supernatural reward. That being deprived of grace, we can do nothing at all to merit heaven. But once grace is infused into us, we can merit heaven because the cooperation with grace makes our actions have a supernatural merit which it lacked previously. Now, of course, there are hard questions about, say, the church's teaching that baptism is necessary for salvation, right? We've got now implicit baptism or implicit baptism of desire. And so one might say, following that idea, if implicit baptism of desire, that is, those who were, who died like the holy innocents before they could even understand Christ, if they could make it to heaven on the basis of that implicit desire, then perhaps implicit desire is also by itself meritorious. Extremely thinly meritorious, but meritorious all the same.
I was actually more wondering about like the normal water baptism, because so the baptism will give one a capacity for merit, but does the child who dies 10 days after birth, having just been baptized, have they exercised that capacity in a way that merited anything? I mean, maybe. I mean, it's possible. I mean, I'm actually quite open to it if there's some miracle happens and the child does, in fact, make a free decision. But that seems like going beyond the church's teaching. It's compatible with it, but I think it goes beyond it.
Yeah, these are, important questions, but given that the church teaches this about merit, I feel safe to say, well, it is true, even though there are hard questions to be asked about it.
Yeah, it could be just true for us, though. It could be true for us that for us it has to be merited, but not.
The doggy door.
Yeah.
How much time do we have to do Q&A? Okay, I'm sort of out of questions, so
I like let me try something on you, right? So you talked of these transitory things whose purpose is to, bring us closer to God in this life, and then we don't need them anymore. I wonder, I mean, people often say that Catholicism is kind of a religion of the both and. It's like, it's marriage is about reproduction and union. Baptism is both, it gives grace and there's actual cleansing because the actual water gets used. The Eucharist is Christ's body, but it's also real food. Wouldn't it seem more in the spirit of the both and to think, yeah, these things we have in this life, many of them, like our relationships with the animals, they help bring us to God. Maybe the unconditional love we can get from our pets sort of is an image of the kind of love we should have for God and maybe helps us. But wouldn't it be better if we had the reality that it's pointing to and the thing that's doing the pointing still?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not opposed to it. Mm-hmm. And to be clear, I don't think anything that I've said tonight is certain. However, I think some of the worries that I have about the sort of blessedness that would exist for the natural world in heaven seem more this worldly than heavenly. And so I guess my major consideration is that although it may be fitting for us, and maybe even fitting in this sort of way of the preservation of goodness, it seems like whatever world that they would have would just be like this world. And so, if so, it seems like it's simpler just to say this world was their blessed world, even if it seemed like it could have had some better variety up in heaven.
Yeah. Maybe though it's better if we have a continuing share in their blessedness. So maybe they have this worldly blessedness around us while we have a continuing share in it. I'm not really strongly given to the thought that the animals are raised to rationality. I like the thought maybe what we have is a kind of wilderness park. We're part of it. It's there for us, available. But for the animals, they just enjoy a more perfect version of the kind of stuff they've got here. Is it time to
I think we should do Q&A.
All right.
So we can sit at the table.
Go ahead. Father Stephen, I think you had someone that's going to help run microphones. Yep, there we go.
Is that microphone live back there?
Yeah, that's for the one.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Who has a question for Dr. Pruss or for Dr. Besong?
Or for a dog.
Or for Claire? Yes, I see that hand.
This is for Dr. Besong. Hi. I wanted to start by asking, who hurt you? But I also had to ask, you said before that dogs may not be given the chance to go to heaven because nobody ever taught them about God. And that kind of reminded me of an argument that you made before in like a previous class about how like some people on like completely foreign land never heard about God, never even knew anything about religion, they would also not be able to get a chance from God. Does that apply to them too? Does that mean that like, is there some sort of an argument against that would mean that both dogs and then anybody else who never learned about God can also go to heaven?
That's a great question, Joel. And to answer your first question, I was born this way, and so I would appreciate some respect. But to answer the second question, right? So there's this long tradition of thinking of people who were in distant lands who lived up to the dictates of their conscience, that in doing so they were obeying implicitly the voice of God. Right? Now, it can be really hard to constantly listen to your conscience, but presumably there are people who have never been exposed to the teachings of Christianity in particular, or religion broadly, but who intuitively and instinctively have responded to God's call in their mind. Now, I would say that that's fundamentally different from an animal who lacks all conscience and all ability to reason through its actions. Now, there are good boys, right, or good girls. All the same, right, what they're doing is driven by instincts. And so this is why dogs get trained, right? It's squeaking at me over here. And so I think of this as a fundamental difference. So I don't think the doggy door could be from, let's say, the obedience to conscience or to the implicit living out of a life of faith without the explicit revelation of God.
No, I mean, I think I think that's a fair point about the difference. I mean, it may not apply to, infants or something. Yeah.
Another question?
That's it, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Besong and Dr.
Another
Pruss.
question?
Thank you, Dr. McNabb. So you guys kind of addressed this already, but I was just wondering if you could expand upon it. In our tradition, we have this idea of the qualities of the risen body, such as agility. People like Aquinas, Bonaventure affirm these. So Dr. Besong, it seems like your account leaves almost no room for that quality. I was just wondering if you could say a little more about that. Dr. Pruss, do you just have any thoughts on what agility looks like?
I don't understand why I'm getting all the questions. Yeah, okay, so I did mention this, that it seems like what God wouldn't reward us with these extra accessory glorifications were it not for the fact that they could be used and have some appropriate use. All the same, to me, this is shrouded in mystery. And even if there is like a sort of heavenly landscape, the worries that I have about a sort of muted animal blessedness in heaven wouldn't apply to buildings and to rocks and to trees and things like that, because you don't really have to worry about a muted oak tree blessedness, or like the heavenly Jerusalem. There's no real worries about blessing the walls of heavenly Jerusalem. So if you can hop over them, you can go through them, perhaps they're there. I don't think this is like something that we know for certain, and so I'm open to it. But I also... Yeah. I'll be done. I don't know if Dr. Pruss wants to say something about that.
So I don't know how, I don't know that the tradition on these special gifts has a lot of magisterial weight behind it. I think it's more of a theological speculation. I like Augustine's idea that one of the things we lost in the fall was control over our bodies. So we have all of these involuntary functions, and we had like this much better, maybe even perfect, Augustine thinks, control of our bodies before that. In the case of agility, that would really, just agility really is just control of the body. So I think it could just be something more like a natural agility, but with like this perfect control of one's bodily functioning. So what would it be like? Well, watch some gymnastics and think even better than that.
Dr. Pruss focuses on agility because he is the only philosopher I know who is a Guinness record holder mountain climber.
All right, next question. Come on, this crowd's got more energy than
I
jump
saw a
up.
hand over there.
It's Phyllis.
Okay, good. For Dr. Pruss, if sanctifying grace is necessary for salvation, how would the animals go about achieving that or getting that?
Well, so I think it's God could have given us sanctifying grace without our choice. Right? In fact, presumably, some sort of sanctifying grace was given to the first human beings without their choice. It's the pattern for God's treatment of us that if we have not received sanctifying grace in this life, we will not receive it in the next. I think that's a pattern that God doesn't have to follow with all the species that he deals with. For all we know, there are other rational beings out there that have bodies, and it might be treated differently from us. So if on the theory that animals might actually have something like the beatific vision, yeah, they would need sanctifying grace because it exceeds the power of their nature to even desire it. Even more than it exceeds ours, even though it exceeds ours infinitely, but it's in some sense it exceeds it even more in their case. So they would need sanctifying grace, but they wouldn't need to receive it in this life. They could receive it as the beginning of their next life.
Father Stephen, do you have any questions from the live feed?
Okay.
You have a question.
He's just just focusing on us.
No, okay. Yes.
Several of you have mentioned openness to other rational creatures beyond humans. I'm just curious, commentary on that. You know, you kind of just threw it out there and then just kind of brought it back. But I heard at least once, if not twice tonight. I'd be curious, just commentary on that in general.
So Dr. McNabb actually has a paper definitively proving that extraterrestrials are incompatible with Christianity.
The opposite. The opposite.
My own view is that the incarnation indicates that humanity has a special place in creation and that consequently we're the only one, but I don't know if Dr. Pruss has any views on this.
I mean, there's multiple options with regard. Yeah, I mean, obviously we don't know, right? We see only so much, but it's a vast universe. Could we be the only intelligent ones? Sure. It seems like it's not that easy to produce intelligence. Could be that it's only in one place. But it could also be broader than us. As to the incarnation, I guess there's several, options. Option one, there are other rational beings and they did not fall. I mean, it was not inevitable that Adam and Eve fell. It was their choice. They were given grace. They could have resisted. They were capable of resisting. I mean, if you think about the story we get in Genesis, like, it actually doesn't seem super likely that they would go for that deal, with the devil, right? I mean, they went for it, but I mean, they had a companionship with God or love of God. They gave all that up. We could, I think, easily imagine beings that made the more intelligent choice and didn't give that up. So that's one possibility. We could have rational beings that never had a fall and don't need an incarnation to save us. We could have another option, which is that there are other rational beings and they fell like us, and they have their own incarnation. Thomas Aquinas spends a little bit of time arguing that there could be multiple incarnations as a matter of just talking about God's power. God has the power to do one. He could have the power, he could do two, or three, or any number of them. So it could be that they have an incarnation and some method of salvation there. It could be, another possibility is that they have that they fell and they're saved in some other way. Again, we get Thomas Aquinas thinks that the incarnation is the most fitting way to save, but it need not be the only way to save. God could just forgive. It might be somewhat less fitting, but God could do it. And another option, I don't like this one quite as much as the others, but it could be that there were other beings and they fell, and we will be in contact with them and we can bring them the gospel and they are saved through Christ, because ultimately what matters is not the species you are, but your status as fellow rational animals. And so just as we and Jesus are rational animals, they will be rational animals, and the salvation and the sacrifice of the cross could come from the sacrifice of Jesus to them. I'm slightly less inclined to that one because it seems sort of, why are we so lucky that we get the first meeting? But then somebody has to get the first meeting with Jesus, so maybe it's not. Maybe we just are so lucky.
Just saying, there's a paper titled, "Houston, Do We Have a Problem? Extraterrestrial Intelligent Life and Christian Belief?" Okay? McNabb, McIntosh. Saying you can Google it. You can Google it. I have a question for Dr. Pruss. So there's not a whole lot, but some evidence, a little evidence, you know where I'm going with this, to suggest that certain chimpanzees might actually have some sort of awareness that may be related to a religious orientation, right? You don't have to buy that. We can just say, we can imagine that it's possible, right? Could it be that in heaven, animals sort of gain additional powers, faculties, without sort of turning them into a person, but sort of just enabling them to become aware in the same way that they're aware of us, aware of God. Or perhaps you don't even have to go that far, and you might just think that being aware of the resurrected Jesus and having a relationship with the resurrected Jesus, even qua dog, that maybe it'll be like such a great relationship. They'll gain lots of pleasure from it, etc. You don't have to go full beatific vision, but the idea is that we can come up with some sort of awareness that's in part kind of meaningful and pleasurable for animals without sort of destroying their natures. I don't know, so I wanted to hear your thoughts on that sort of approach.
I really like that thought. I wish I had it when I was sketching the options earlier. I think that's a great idea. I mean, I'm thinking about something like in this life, right? We have religious experiences of God, or at least many people report having them. Feelings of closeness to God, some kind of mystical union with God. These are not the beatific vision. This is not the vision of God face to face. This is seeing in a glass darkly, as Paul puts it. But there's something there, and it's when it happens, it is wonderful. People are transformed by this kind of thing. It gives meaning to their lives. The beatific vision, of course, exceeds that infinitely because it is a vision of God face to face and not through a creature and so on. But these kinds of things are themselves wonderful. And I think an attenuated version or a modified version or a doggy version of this, whatever that would be like, is something that we could imagine. I mean, don't people say that the dogs do already treat us as gods? Well, they could treat God as God.
And that's all we have time for. Go ahead, this will be the last comment from Dr. Besong, and then we'll give a round of applause.
Okay, so Alex, I've got an objection to beatific vision light. Okay, so here's the objection. An animal gets up to heaven, right, and it's given an increase of its ability to have this sort of like background awareness version, like whatever the beatific vision is, you turn the volume down all the way to, let's say, 1/2 or something, if you've got the volume knob of the beatific vision. Okay, so now the animal is worried or complains, why can't I get more? And in the human case, you would say, well, what you have of the beatific vision corresponds to your choices, right, not to your nature. But you might think, well, okay, the animal's been deprived of choices, and so what's the alternative? Well, you could say, well, this is the most that your nature is capable of, so we've maxed it out, right? It just turns out that your nature is only capable as a very light version of the beatific vision, right? But if that's the case, why couldn't God have said, but your nature is not capable of the beatific vision at all, so why raise it to 1/2 when, God's already sort of capped it off, as it were, prior to their death? Like, their animal nature has already capped it off.
Well, I mean, in a way, our nature caps it off too. We are not naturally capable of the beatific vision, and yet God chooses in His graciousness to give us something that goes beyond that nature. Doesn't seem impossible to think God, doesn't seem unreasonable to think God could do something similar for animals. He just gives them something more. I wouldn't call it beatific vision light. I think beatific vision is not something that, I mean, it is in a way something that can come by degrees, but all of them are degrees of the beatific vision, and they're all beatific vision. The thing we're talking about is not the beatific vision. It is not a vision of God face to face. It is something else, some kind of maybe awareness or something.
All right, well, thank you very much, Dr. Pruss and Dr.
Thank you all.